In part 2 of this two-part video series on evaluating classification models, we'll explore how we might tune our classification rule to optimize its sensitivity and specificity. The most important consideration here is context. Mainly, what are the consequences of misclassification? Consider two scenarios. First, suppose we wish to classify a patient as either having a certain infectious disease or not having the disease. In this case, a false positive would lead to false alarm. A person that doesn't have the disease might think that they do. A false negative would occur if somebody does have the disease, but our model doesn't detect it. The consequences of this misclassification could include the patient spreading the disease to others or not getting the treatment that they need. Subjectively, then, these consequences of a false negative could be worse than those of a false alarm. Thus, in this context, we might want to prioritize high sensitivity in order to avoid false negatives or to increase the true positives. In a second scenario, suppose we want to classify an email as either spam or not spam. In this case, a false positive would result in putting a real email in the spam folder, thus possibly missing important communications or information. A false negative would result in getting a spam email in your inbox, the consequences just being annoyance. In this case, since the consequences of missing important information are typically more serious than being annoyed, we might prioritize high specificity in order to avoid false positives or, equivalently, to increase the true negatives. In addition to context, some visualizations can help us tune our classification rules. Let's first consider predicted probability box plots and jitter plots. First, for each data point in our sample, we have an observed outcome of rain, as well as the predicted probability of rain as calculated by our logistic regression model. Exploring how these probabilities break down among rainy and non-rainy days can help us identify an appropriate probability threshold for our classification rule. For example, we can examine the box plots of the predicted probability of rain for days on which it actually didn't rain and days on which it did. In general, and luckily, we notice here that our model predicted probability of rain tends to be higher on rainy days, the right box plot, than on non-rainy days. A jitter plot of each individual data point loses the nice simple trends illuminated by these box plots, but provides some more detail. Now, remember that our original classification rule used a probability threshold of 0.5. Mathematically, this threshold at which rain is equally likely to happen or not makes some sense. But it appears to be contextually arbitrary. It cuts right through the bulk of the rainy days, thereby producing a bunch of false negatives and not well distinguishing between rainy and non-rainy days. Suppose instead that we dropped our probability threshold from 0.5 to 0.24 in the region of separation between the probability box plots for non-rainy and rainy days. This better distinguishes between these two categories. Per the box plot, roughly 75% of rainy days have probability predictions above this threshold, and roughly 75% of non-rainy days have probability predictions below this threshold. That is, the sensitivity and specificity corresponding to this rule would both be around 75%. Finally, let's consider a more nuanced visual tool, the Receiver Operating Characteristic Curve, or ROC curve for short. For every possible probability threshold between 0 and 1, the ROC curve calculates and plots the corresponding sensitivity on the y-axis and 1 minus specificity on the x-axis. Whereas specificity is the probability of correctly classifying y equals 0 as y equals 0, 1 minus specificity is the probability of misclassifying y equals 0 as y equals 1. That is, it's the false positive rate. In our rain example, then, 1 minus specificity is the probability of misclassifying no rain as rain. In our first video, we calculated these metrics for just two possible probability thresholds. First, a threshold of 0.5 had a sensitivity of 0.526 and a specificity of 0.912, hence a 1 minus specificity of 0.088. These results are represented by the dot here. Second, dropping the probability threshold to 0.05 had a sensitivity of 0.981 and a specificity of 0.182, hence a 1 minus specificity of 0.818. These two thresholds are just 2 points along the ROC curve. Each point along this curve corresponds to other possible probability thresholds between 0 and 1. So what's the point? First, the ROC curve highlights the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. Specifically, as we decrease the probability threshold, it reflects the degree to which sensitivity increases and 1 minus specificity increases, that is, specificity decreases. Further, the ROC curve provides calculations of sensitivity and specificity for, again, each possible threshold. This allows us to identify an appropriate threshold without having to do all the calculations ourselves. Mainly, we don't have to go through all the steps that we did to evaluate and compare the 0.5 and 0.05 thresholds. As one example, recall that our earlier inspection of the probability box plots suggested that a 0.24 probability threshold might be reasonable. The ROC plot and underlying information indicates that this threshold would have a sensitivity and specificity of roughly 75% each, hence a 1 minus specificity of around 25%. It also turns out that the area under the ROC curve provides some important information. It measures the overall effectiveness of our classification model in distinguishing between y equals 1 and y equals 0, here between rain and no rain. Specifically, suppose we have two data points, one having y equals 1 and the other having y equals 0. Then for both data points, we use our model to calculate the probability that y is 1. Then the area under the curve, or AUC, measures the proportion of time that our model assigns a higher probability to the y equals 1 data point than to the y equals 0 data point. Thus, the proportion of time that it correctly identifies which is which. In this case, the closer the AUC is to 1, the better. As an example, our logistic regression model for rain has an AUC of 0.835, which is pretty good. Specifically, suppose we give our model the humidity and sunshine levels for a day on which it did rain and a day on which it didn't. Then there's an 83.5% chance that our model would assign a higher probability of rain to the rainy day than to the non-rainy day. Hence an 83.5% chance that it would correctly identify which is the rainy day and which is the non-rainy day. The ROC plot also provides a point of comparison. The dashed diagonal line here is called the no discrimination line. It represents the simplest possible classification model that just randomly guesses rain or no rain when given a pair of data points. This random guess model always has an AUC of 0.5. This makes sense mathematically as the area of the triangle here. It also makes sense conceptually. If we present any model with a day on which it did actually rain and a day on which it didn't, this guessing model simply flips a coin to guess which is the rainy day and which is the non-rainy day. As a result, there's a 50% chance that the random guess would end up being correct. Our model of rain is clearly better, but this is just the beginning. We'll use our classification metrics and plots to evaluate and compare more competitive models.